All right. Hello, everyone. This is Volts for March 12th, 2025. Who is paying for all that data center power? I'm your host, David Roberts. As everyone in energy world knows by now, data centers are coming, and they are going to increase demand for electricity by an amount that no one really knows, but everyone seems to agree will be quite large. If the more enthusiastic forecasts bear out, data centers could go from consuming roughly 1% of U.S. electricity to something more like 12% by 2030, quintupling the pace of demand growth. There are some reasons for skepticism regarding those upper-end forecasts, but even the more modest ones are daunting. In many regions, and for many utilities, data centers not only represent the vast bulk of electricity demand growth in coming years, they could quickly become the vast bulk of electricity demand, period. How is that going to affect the relationship between hyperscalers and between utilities and their other customers? Who is going to pay for all the new electricity infrastructure required to connect and run all of those data centers? These questions are mostly being decided behind the scenes in obscure utility rate cases, but they deserve to be brought to light. To that end, I just read a great new paper called Extracting Profits from the Public: How Utility Ratepayers Are Paying for Big Tech's Power. I am lucky enough to have the authors, Eliza Martin and Ari Peskoe, here with me to talk through it. Eliza is a legal fellow in the Environmental and Energy Law program at Harvard Law School, and Ari, a repeat Volts guest, runs that school's Electricity Law Initiative. We are going to get into some nerdy stuff about rate making, but also some bigger and more fundamental questions about the future of electricity regulation in an age of AI. With no further ado, Eliza Martin and Ari Peskoe, welcome to Volts. Thank you all both so much for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for having us.
This paper is just, I am the target audience for this paper. This paper is squarely targeted at my pleasure zones, but it's quite technical. So just a little bit of background. I think the reason we're all talking about this is that the electricity system is changing very quickly in some very fundamental ways. The main thing is these new loads are coming online, and this is not like the past 20 years of loads coming online. It's not like a new house coming online. It's not even like a new business, even a new factory coming on. These are enormous loads. Like when you have like a gigawatt chunk of new load, that's just like a new thing for utilities. And we're having not just one of them, but a whole series of them. So basically, like this rush of data centers is crashing into our conventional way of running utilities and regulating utilities and setting rates in such a way as to make a mess. And the danger in that mess is that ordinary ratepayers are going to end up stuck with the bill for a lot of the new expenses required by these big data centers. And I think we can all agree that having ordinary ratepayers subsidize mega jillion dollar companies is not a good outcome. So that's why we're all worried about this. That's why we're talking about this. But I think to understand why and how that might happen requires a little bit of delving into utility business. So I think the place to start is listeners may or may not know. I think listeners, they know they pay their electricity utility a certain rate, a certain amount per unit of energy. What they may not know is that for any utility, there are multiple classes of ratepayers that pay different rates. And the principle that is supposed to guide the setting of rates for different classes of customers is called cost causation. So maybe, Eliza, we can just start there. Like, what is the principle of cost causation? What are utilities trying to do here?
Sure. So cost causation is really just sort of the guiding principle in rate making, that consumer prices should align with the cost that the utility company incurs to provide service to that group of people. So it's more expensive for utilities to provide service to certain groups of people. Ratepayers who are normal homeowners, they're spread across a longer distance. So maybe there's more distribution infrastructure. So the costs are just a little bit different for different groups of people, but it's a very imperfect system.
There's no objective method for allocating these costs generally. Set aside the data center issue. If a utility wants to build a new power plant because demand is growing, how are you going to split that cost among, let's say, residential, commercial, and industrial ratepayers? One way you might think about doing it is just, well, we'll just do it in proportion to how much energy each group is consuming. And that might seem like a fair way to do it. Mm-hmm. But you might also say, well, actually, what's really driving the need for this new power plant is that growth in peak demand, right? That in that hot summer day, that's really why we need this new power plant. And so let's actually split these costs based on how much each of those ratepayer classes contributes to that peak. And there's no real objective way to say which way is right and which way is wrong. And so you just have all these groups coming in arguing in their own self-interest for why their way is sort of the objectively right way to do it, even though it's just a sort of subjective determination.
Yeah. And just to underline the point you're making, it's not that there is some objective way that they're all lying about. There is no fact of the matter here. There is no right answer about cost. These are inherently subjective decisions.
It's everyone coming in arguing for their own self-interest.
Which is again, you can sort of make sense of in your head when you're talking about normal customers, right? But again, if you're a multi-billion-dollar company with a gigawatt of new load coming, is clearly going to have resources in that fight that other people in that fight don't have. They're clearly going to be the 800-pound gorilla in that fight. So the way utilities do this is they add up all the revenue they think they're going to need in their next rate period, and then they get that approved by the Public Utility Commission, and then they divide that up. Who's going to pay what in that amount? These different ratepayer classes. So obviously, you have these different ratepayer classes sort of jockeying against one another, trying to lower their rates and increase the other rates for the other guy. And there's a lot of fuzziness, as you say, involved in that. So maybe just talk a little bit, Eliza, about what is the source of that fuzziness? I mean, there's not a clear, sum answer. You can say, this class of customers costs the utility X amount. There's lots of fuzziness. So maybe just talk a little bit about what are some of the sources of uncertainty and fuzziness in that process.
So I think that there is this initial fuzziness, as you mentioned, sort of about what the revenue requirement is for the utility company. This process is really utility driven. So the utility proposes how much money it needs to recover first. So that in and of itself is a contested issue. Mm-hmm. And then you have the actual, as you mentioned, the sort of discussion amongst the different groups of people about how much money they should be paying for their costs. So industrial consumers have, they'll get attorneys and everyone will comb through the utility filings and try to argue that their cost should be lower than, say, the normal consumer's cost. But it's not an exact science. It's a really messy process that's based on competing approaches to cost causation. And it's a battle sort of in the filings about who should be paying what.
And as you say, PUCs, public utility commissions who are hearing these cases, they might have their own preferences too.
Public utility commissions are inherently a political body. So in some states, the regulators are appointed by the governor. In other states, they're elected officials. So there's political pressure, whether that's from a governor or whether that's from, the people that elect these regulators to favor their interests. So, it's not a scientific process, for better or for worse.
Yes. Also, the one other thing you mentioned in the paper, the reason there's some fuzziness in this process is that, and here I have in my notes, it says, utilities lie, which is just to say, when a bunch of people are arguing about how much they're costing the utility. That's pretty technical. There's lots of numbers involved. There's lots of information involved. And the PUCs are sort of reliant on utilities to tell them that information. And as you document in the paper, several times, utilities have been caught basically just lying about the cost of various things. So that fuzzes up the process too. So then alongside this process where you have ratepayer classes competing over who's going to get the lowest rates, alongside that you have these special contracts, which are like, it's funny, I'm constantly coming across new stuff in the electricity world where I'm just like, can't believe it exists. I felt that way the first time I found out about utility holding companies. Like, we legally separate generators and transmission companies, and then we just allow one company to own them both? How is that separation? Anyway, so special contracts. So Eliza, what is a special contract? If they already have this process, what is a special contract on top of this process?
That's an excellent question. Special contracts are really just statutorily created mechanisms that allow a utility company to request a deviation for a customer from the standard rate. So oftentimes they'll have to be approved by a public utility commission, although Mississippi recently changed that law for data center customers. So it just allows utility to offer terms of service to an individual consumer that otherwise aren't available for anyone else.
I'd have to say again, that just seems crazy on its face that individual ratepayers, individual customers are negotiating their own bespoke individual rates with utilities. And so when you say political pressure, why would there be political pressure to do these things? Like, what's the background there?
Oftentimes it's that regulators don't want to be seen as the veto point for an economic development opportunity. So if, a governor's publicized that there's a big data center that's coming to locate in this area of their state, then regulators don't want to be the reason why, that economic opportunity or that data center decides to not locate there. So there may be pressure to approve a special contract.
Yeah, lots of politicians want these things to come, and then I guess are probably pressuring their PCs to make things easier on them to come. So these are the process. You have ratepayer classes arguing over cost causation, and then sort of alongside that, orthogonally, you have special contracts whereby utilities are creating special rates for individual customers. So this is the background. This is the process that's going on. I want to discuss the many ways within that process that costs can get shifted to the public through shenanigans. But before we get to the shenanigans, it's worth making the point you make in the paper that just if rate cases just proceed in the normal way, that's going to involve some cost shifting. Because of when new customers come on and you need some new infrastructure to serve the customers, new power lines, say, who pays for those new power lines? What happens is the cost tends to get split. Maybe, Eliza, we could just walk through that before we get to the sort of shady stuff, just like the normal way that new customers are treated and that new infrastructure is treated inherently involves some shifting of these new costs onto ratepayers. Can you walk through that a little bit?
Sure. So just when a utility decides that or anticipates that there's going to be increased demand on its system, it just, projects that it will have X amount of new capital costs for its infrastructure.
Yeah, and these are power lines, transformers, that kind of stuff.
And, that's the bread and butter of utility profits because they enjoy an opportunity to earn a rate of return on that infrastructure. So utilities have always had an incentive to pursue growth. And so they will just do that in their normal, rate cases. They'll say that there's a lot of demand and that they need to build new infrastructure to meet that demand. And then they'll use the cost allocation formula that they already have approved by the Public Utility Commission to spread those costs across everyone else.
Yeah, we're going to get to those screwy cost allocation measures. But maybe just by way of preview here, it's just worth saying. So you could say, and utilities have said in previous cases, X new big customers coming online in our system. That's going to require us to build X new amount of transformers and power lines and whatever else that will cost X amount. But that new infrastructure will benefit everyone in our region, not just the new customer. And so everybody should share the cost of that new infrastructure, which makes sense if you're talking about adding normal, like a subdivision or a commercial center or normal loads. But when you're talking about adding a gigawatt new load to a utility area that maybe, only has a couple of gigawatts of demand in the first place, then it seems crazy to share the cost of that across everybody. Then it's very obviously that new customer that you're doing the new stuff for. So let's talk about some of the ways that costs are getting shifted. And one is through going through these special contracts. And it's crazy to me to read about, Eliza, but like these special contracts, as you say, they're often like big new economic development is coming to our area. Let's do this, right? So there's pressure on legislators, there's pressure on the PUC, pressure on the utility. Let's do this. Everybody wants this. Let's do this. And so they do these special contracts outside of the normal process. And as you write in the paper, these special contracts get incredibly little scrutiny. So maybe just talk about some of the ways that the terms of these special contracts can serve to kind of shift costs to ratepayers. And why aren't they being, I guess that, we're back to the political pressure again, but it just seems crazy to me that some of the biggest, these are some of the biggest decisions you're going to make around your electricity system. To move those biggest decisions into a private process that bears no scrutiny seems crazy to me. But talk a little bit about what goes on in these special deals.
There's a whole plethora of procedural issues. When Ari and I were looking through the contracts, the terms are not publicly available. The utility will make a claim that there's proprietary price information and that the public can't see these pricing terms. But of course, that creates an issue because if there is a cost shift, so if the utility is offering a price that is lower than the utility's cost of service to serve that ratepayer, then the problem is no one really knows until there is, down the line, there may be a rate case and the utility has a much higher revenue requirement. So, there's this initial claim for proprietary information, and then the regulators often just reflexively approve that. So I did not run across a contract where the PUC rejected a claim for proprietary information.
Really? Not one?
No, I don't. Some were more redacted than others, but I did not see a contract that was totally available, which is unfortunate. Yeah,
it's wild. So, again, we're like a publicly granted utility, monopoly utility, striking a deal with a private party that the public is not allowed to know what the deal is. Again, seems crazy to me. Ari, maybe you can tackle this one. One of the kind of subtle things that's going on in here is that utilities, again, we're back to utility holding companies that own both sort of competitive businesses in competitive markets and regulated utilities. And they have some incentive to shift costs from the one to the other. So maybe explain how that works in the context of a special contract.
Yeah, one reason we're skeptical about these deals is because of the long history of utilities exploiting their monopolies to benefit their competitive lines of business. And there's certainly right now a nationwide competition to attract these data centers because building the infrastructure can be sort of lucrative business for the utilities.
Right. As Volts listeners are well aware, but I'll say it one more time. This is how utilities make money. They make money by spending money.
Right.
So they want to build a lot of infrastructure. A new data center coming is an excuse to build a bunch of infrastructure. So they all want the data centers.
Yeah. So utility regulators are supposed to watch out for these incentives and opportunities to exploit your captive customers that basically have to pay your bills. And so what we're concerned about and what regulators ought to be more concerned about, and it's distressing that there's not more concern in these special contract proceedings, is whether or not utilities are, in fact, through these secret contracts, shifting costs of discounted rates to big tech companies onto other ratepayers.
Right. Maybe go into a little bit more about the distinction a utility has between its competitive and its non-competitive arms and how this cost shifting works, like a little bit the mechanics of what the cost shift is. Does that question even make sense?
Oh, I'm not, well, so, in this particular case, it's not really so there are instances where the utility does have an affiliated business and it can use ratepayer funds to prop up that business, right? So for instance, the utility owns a power plant that's through one of its corporate affiliates, and it has that corporate affiliate sign a contract with the utility. And the utility can sign an inflated rate because it has captive ratepayers that will have to pay for that contract. And that's a way to sort of funnel money to this business, this power plant that has to compete in the market. Here, it's slightly different in that these are both sort of utility businesses. The data center is part of the utility's business, and the sort of captive ratepayers are part of the utility business as well. The distinction is, though, that there's these captive ratepayers that have to pay their bills, and then there's this utility also trying to attract these customers that have the ability to sort of go in all different parts of the country, these big data centers. And that, again, but it's the similar concern, which is that the captive ratepayers may be subsidizing the utility's sort of competitive lines of business. And here, though, there's just no affiliate company, but it's the same kind of principle.
Right. Another way of shifting costs is this, call it a gap between federal and state regulations. So FERC sort of tells the PUC to divide up transmission costs, and the PUC has this cost allocation formula. Talk a little bit, Eliza, about how those cost allocation formulas end up serving as a subsidy.
There's a couple of different issues. So, first, FERC approves a cost allocation method for its RTOs. So, like if FERC approves its cost allocation for PJM, which splits certain costs and assigns them to the utilities, then each state will allocate the costs that are assigned by the RTO to ratepayer classes of every utility that it regulates. So the result of this is really that residential ratepayers who, are not maybe causing an RTO to plan new transmission the way that the data center wants, that they're still bearing the cost for that. And, transmission is complicated just because, there are benefits that flow from that for all of us, but the way that the transmission is being built and for whom it's being built results in this cost shifting, potentially through FERC approved to, PUC approved cost allocation.
I would go a little stronger on this and just say that, PJM's regional transmission plan was $5 billion last year. And they said data center growth is one of the main drivers. PJM's role here is basically to bill each utility, but it's then up to the state regulators and the utility to figure out how those costs are divided among residential, commercial, et cetera. And the bottom line is that in some states, we have residential ratepayers bearing 2/3 of the cost of this new transmission that is really being designed for data center growth. Now, there are some ancillary benefits that ratepayers do receive from this new transmission. So it's not like they're not getting any value out of it, but they're certainly not the cost causers of that new transmission. And I think, this sort of approach to cost allocation is really on the presumption that we're building broadly beneficial projects. And that's simply just not the case when we have a few identifiable, very wealthy corporations that are driving a lot of this need.
Right. And just to repeat this point one more time, up till now, the assumption that new transmission infrastructure was broadly beneficial to all utility ratepayers more or less held. This is it's a new state of affairs that you get a gigawatt new customer for whom you have to build considerable new infrastructure, right? So these assumptions that it's not that this was necessarily a shady or corrupt practice, it's just not suited to the present circumstance, maybe you could say.
That's right. I mean, it's the scale and the speed of the forecasted growth that certainly doesn't have a, let's say, modern day precedent, certainly not in the past several decades.
Right.
And a lot of the whole approach to regional cost allocation has really just evolved relatively recently.
Yeah. And then another way PUCs allocate costs is by peak demand. So as we mentioned earlier, a lot of infrastructure gets built just to meet these peaks of demand at certain times of day, certain times of year. And so this is another thing that's just kind of jaw-dropping. So like utilities charge big customers peak demand charges for their contribution to those peaks. But apparently, it's entirely possible for a data center to find out what period of time is the utility's peak, thereby what period of time the utility is going to use as a reference, and then it can just reduce its power use for that couple of hours and thereby reduce its demand charges all year. Eliza, is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yes, basically. And we've heard that, there's companies that sort of do this that help people forecast when peak demand is. So it is a way that you can cost shift if the system is built based on a theory of peak demand.
Yeah, and it's one of the things you're fiddling around with a couple of megawatts too. But again, like if you're fiddling around with a gigawatt, that's going to make a substantial difference to the final outcome.
Yeah, and again, it's this problem of scale because other energy users can also, stop using utility delivered power in order to reduce their demand charges, but the scale of this can potentially have a major impact. And I'd also just add that, there are better ways to design demand charges that can mitigate this possibility, but it's really a matter of what the utilities and what regulators have approved. And there are some on the books that can allow for this just massive avoidance of costs. And the other aspect of this is that so many of these data centers have just this armada of diesel generators on site that when this peak demand hour comes, they can keep operating by just turning on all these diesel generators, but they can save money in the process. Yeah. So the incentives here are just all unfortunate.
Yeah. And again, it's like one thing if a utility sort of misses a megawatt or two, but it's another thing if it's like the scale we're talking about. And the third way you mentioned about shifting costs, which I found really interesting, is you have some suspicion around co-location here. And we're going to get into a different kind of co-location later when we talk about solutions to all this. But it seems like you all see some shenanigans going on under the banner of co-location currently. So Eliza, maybe just talk to us about how that works. What do you think data centers are trying to kind of get away with this co-location strategy?
Well, co-location it's obviously top of mind given the FERC proceeding, but a general co-location arrangement, or the type that we sort of talk about in the paper, is when a data center would connect directly to an existing power plant behind the point of interconnection. And so by delivering and taking power without using the transmission network, power plant owners and data centers argue that they should be exempt from paying any utility delivery fees or, any grid services, basically.
Right. So you got a data center right next to a nuclear plant. They're both behind the interconnection to the grid. The nuclear plant is feeding power directly into the data center. And so both the nuclear plant and the data center are arguing to the utility, we're not using your transmission infrastructure for this. It's just a direct connection. Therefore, we should not have to pay these fees and for the upkeep of the transmission charges. That's what they're trying to do.
Yes. And there's, some discussion about whether or not that really is a feasible technical arrangement, like, whether it's fully integrated with the grid or whether it's isolated. So there's some technical issues around it, and then just the regulatory issues, which is, is this allowed, who regulates it? That's sort of the ongoing FERC proceeding.
Have we gotten PUC rulings on this yet? Like, are PUCs allowing it? What's the trend?
Well, these transmission issues are under FERC's jurisdiction, but But there is, to the extent we have a nuclear plant selling directly to a data center, that could be a retail sale that would be under state jurisdiction. So this type of co-location is probably only allowed in states that have sort of opened up the system a little more to retail competition, which is primarily the Northeast and a couple other states out there.
Right. And the thing that strikes me immediately, like if I were a PUC commissioner, I would be thinking like the data center plopping down next to the nuclear plant is going to siphon off an enormous amount of the nuclear plant's power. And then wherever else that power was going is then not going to have power. And then you're going to have to build the infrastructure for that missing power, in other words, it seems like even if you're not directly mechanically using the transmission system, it seems like you are still having a substantial effect on the transmission system such that you should pay. Is that crazy?
No, that's potentially the largest cost shift here is if this nuclear plant is no longer selling into the market. The market prices are set basically by supply and demand. And so if a huge chunk of supply leaves the market, all else equal, prices are going to go up, at least in the short term. And so, if the nuclear plants in PJM, for instance, can make more money by selling directly to data centers, well, then that's what they're going to do. And, there's going to be a shortage, at least for a little while in PJM, and that's going to drive up prices for everybody else.
And just to add, you can end up with extending the life of other assets, that maybe are dirtier because the price has increased, so they can now bid in.
Right. You divert a bunch of your nuclear to a data center, then you have a power shortage, then you have a case for keeping your coal plant open, which is also a shenanigan that's going on. So then let's talk about what to do about all this. And as we've said over and over again, like this is in the utility world, relatively new. This is a giant new thing that's happening. So like everybody's scrambling a little bit. And it seems to me like just intuitively, like kind of the decisions and procedures that get established now are going to have a long tail. And so there's a lot of very important decisions being made now up front. So let's talk a little bit about solutions. One you mentioned, Eliza, the first one is just there should be some guidelines for PUCs reviewing special contracts. It's crazy to me that there aren't, but like, what do you say what you mean by that?
I mean, in some states, like in Kentucky, there's some more specific guidelines or findings that regulators have to make before they can approve a special contract. So it's really, I think, more about showing your work, kind of. So making sure that, the contract, the rate, doesn't exceed the utility's cost to serve that customer, limiting discounts to certain amounts of years if there are any discounts. So being able to just sort of see what the utility is proposing doing and there being a record of that, I think is really what this comes down to. But I mean, ultimately, I think Ari and I are generally pretty skeptical of special contracts, and it ultimately comes down to whether or not the regulators have, the ability, the will to challenge them. So for that reason, we often think that maybe tariffs would be better instead of special contracts. Yeah.
You sort of like the way this is framed is if you're going to use special contracts, at least there should be some guidelines for for assessing them instead of them just being a black box free for all.
And I think maybe the most important criteria that Kentucky has is that they only allow special contracts when there's spare capacity, right? Because then maybe effectively that means we can only offer a discount when we're not going to have to add a lot of new infrastructure to the system.
Right.
And that's just simply not typically the case these days, that we have a lot of spare capacity around.
Yeah.
So that could eliminate the possibility of a number of these contracts across the country if we put in that criteria.
Yeah. And y'all make a note that like guidelines can only do so much. In the end, a lot of this just comes down to you need good regulators. Like a lot of this just comes down to like you need empowered and informed and good judgment having regulators. But as you say, special contracts in general seem shady. And I completely agree. Just like it's amazing to me that they exist. It's hard for me to imagine a principled justification for their existence. It just seems like special deals for big customers who want to rush past the process, which I get why like economic development officers like that, but it seems unfair to the other people using the system. But so the second thing you counsel is just quit using these special contracts and shift to tariffs. And so here we get to what I thought is a really interesting question that's being fought out now in utility proceedings all across the country, which is, should data centers have their own special tariff? Should they just be treated like other industrial customers, have the same tariff that other industrial customers have, or should they have their own for some reason? And this battle is being fought in Ohio, Indiana. FERC weighed in a little bit. What is the case for saying, yes, data centers are special and deserve a special tariff? What is the argument for that side?
It's my understanding that the argument is really based on this idea that similar consumers, similar utility customers should be grouped together if they have similar usage. And like the cost of service for the utility company for providing service to these customers is the same. So that's why you have sort of this ratepayer class, or the consumer residential class, and it's why you have an industrial class. And so there's an argument that data centers, because they are more energy intensive, because they run, 24/7, or they can run 24/7, that they are materially different from other sort of industrial users of energy. And, FERC got into sort of some more nitty-gritty issues around like cryptocurrency customers that they can move. So there's greater stranded asset risk and stuff like that. So utilities have a requirement to provide non-discriminatory service. So the issue is whether or not they can discriminate for data center customers, basically, to isolate them from other consumers.
I wanted to pick up on one point there, which we didn't discuss earlier, which is possibly the biggest potential cost shift here, which is the stranded asset problem.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, what makes data centers potentially different from other large customers is the riskiness. So, we can imagine all sorts of reasons why this data center growth may fizzle out over the next few years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we should say these projections, these are very uncertain. No one knows.
Right.
No one knows what's actually going to happen with data centers.
And so the concern is that utilities are going to start building all of this new transmission, power plants, et cetera. It's going to be billions of dollars of costs, and then the data centers are going to try to cancel their contracts and disappear.
Yes, because also what's going on behind the scenes is that you got multiple states, multiple utilities wooing these data centers. So the data centers have every incentive in the world to play them off one another and to sort of flirt with each one, right?
Yeah, or just, it turns out we don't need all these data centers, maybe.
Right.
And so, one of the unique aspects that utilities benefit from their business model is the idea that they can socialize these risks to ratepayers. And there's a history of utilities trying to pass on these costs of these stranded assets to ratepayers. So one of the key issues in these tariff proceedings is how to ensure that data centers are on the hook for infrastructure costs that the utilities are incurring just to meet these data centers and preventing consumers from being on the hook.
It's one thing if you build, 10 megawatts of infrastructure that you don't need. But again, it's a totally different thing if you build the infrastructure necessary to handle a gigawatt of new load and then the gigawatt doesn't show up. That's a different class of spending.
Yeah, I mean, so in this Ohio proceeding, the utility AEP argues that data centers are distinct because of the sort of newness and riskiness of this sort of new type of customer.
Are PUCs weighing in on this? Like, what are PUCs saying so far about this argument?
We are on the edge of our seats waiting for the Public Utility Commission of Ohio to weigh in on this one.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, FERC did weigh in and just said, it was just one of those sorts of proceedings where FERC just said, there's not enough evidence in this particular docket for us to make a decision in your favor. But they were not sort of uniformly opposed to data centers being different. They just wanted to see a stronger case made. Right.
This seems like such an important question. How this comes out, it seems incredibly significant. So yeah, there's the whole argument about whether you have a special tariff for these things at all because of their scale, because of the riskiness of abandoned assets, and just because, building a giant power line to serve a gigawatt load is not a sort of universally beneficial thing in the way that previous infrastructure build out was. It's very bespoke and very specific. And it's not like you have another gigawatt load that can just slot in there if the data center doesn't show up. So in response to these dilemmas, and this question of whether there should be an individual tariff, a special tariff for this class is there's no capital R right answer. It's somewhat subjective. So in response to sort of these concerns and these questions, y'all end up recommending or sort of coming down in favor of the idea of energy parks, which we discussed here on Volts a couple of months ago. But maybe Eliza, so maybe just tell us, like, what do we mean when we talk about energy parks, and why is there an advantage here? Why does this sort of like clarify this question? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. Maybe just tell us, like, what do we mean when we talk about energy parks, and why is there an advantage here? Why does this sort of like clarify this question?
So an energy park, I guess, is sort of also a form of co-location, but not the one that we were talking about earlier. But basically, the data center customer would bring generation assets, and they would be totally isolated from the grid. So you would avoid the sort of utility interconnection processes. You would be able, if you were a data center customer, you could choose what electricity was the cheapest, or if some of these big companies have commitments to get clean energy. Mm-hmm. So you would be able to isolate yourself from the utility network to bring your own generation.
And then if you're doing that, you're very clearly paying your own costs, right? Like that's kind of like settles the question of cost shifting. Like if you're islanded from the utility, building your own generation and your own connections, that's a clear-cut case of like you're paying your own costs and we're not paying for you. So like, can that happen anywhere right now, or are there regulatory circumstances required for that to work?
There's regulatory
always
changes that need to happen. Yeah, really, there is just state protection of utility monopolies. So state laws would need to be amended to allow these projects.
Right. So if I'm behind the meter building a data center and then I build a giant solar field next to it, and the solar field is powering the data center, I am, in the state's eyes, selling power, which only utilities are allowed to do, right? So what you'd need in that case is, I guess, what we now call retail competition. Is that the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say we did not do a 50-state survey of this issue. This is one of those things where I can give the generic response of it varies by state. And so I think there are many states, particularly where we have the traditional vertically integrated utility that's building all the power plants, where they fiercely defend the scope of their monopolies, and this would most likely not be allowed. Then you have on the other end of the spectrum a state like Texas,
yes,
where particularly if you're in some of the top parts of the state where there are rural cooperative utilities, where you may actually be able to do this sort of arrangement today. But I think, in most of the country, we would likely have to change some of these laws that establish utility monopolies.
And that's a legislature thing, not just a PUC thing.
Most likely, yeah. And, obviously the utilities would generally not be a fan of this sort of change in state law. Just
because, well, explain why. What's the political economy here?
Well, the utilities monopolies are really their most valuable asset. It provides sort of steady and perpetual profits. And so they generally fight against any effort to weaken their monopolies. There's a lighter version of an energy park, which is just that the data center would be the utility customer, but the data center would be allowed or even required to contract itself for new generation. And that would certainly mitigate cost shifts because building power plants is quite expensive. And if you let the utility do it, it then has opportunities to push some of those costs to other consumers. But that would be sort of a compromise position that still a lot of utilities would oppose because they make a lot of money by building those power plants and want to have those opportunities for themselves.
From a kind of wonk perspective, it seems perfect, right? Because there's like giant new customer, clearly paying its own freight, clearly paying for its own power, clearly paying for its own connections. It's very tidy from a wonky perspective, but it seems to me that like the political economy is against it sort of at every turn. Like, is there a substantial, constituency in favor of this solution?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would clarify that this lighter option is not foolproof for protecting consumers because it would still be a utility customer,
right,
presumably still paying for all the delivery charges, and
right,
then there'd still be some opportunities to play some funny games and shift some costs there. But, we went through this about 30 years ago when several states did remove generation from what the utility does, this utility restructuring laws that several states passed. And one of the justifications, rationales for it was that utilities in some parts of the country didn't have the financial strength to fund power plant development.
Right.
And so sort of getting it off their books. And so to the extent that there's just so much growth happening in some parts of the country that maybe there could be some argument for getting this off, utility books. But I don't know if utilities would go for that these days.
One other solution you mention, which is also an intriguing and ongoing argument, is the idea that maybe new data centers should only be allowed to commence service if they commit to being flexible. So there's a lot of argument right now about whether they can be flexible. If you ask the hyperscalers, they'll tell you, no, we need 24/7 power. We need, foolproof power all the time. Like, costs us billions to shut down, et cetera. But then there's been some new research. Tyler Norris had a paper, in his group had a paper about it. There's been a lot of talk about maybe there is some flexibility. So Eliza, maybe just talk about what would you get out of this?
So because, as we sort of talked about, the system is built for peak demand,
right,
we spend a lot of the time during the year not reaching peak demand. So there's theoretically a lot of assets that we've already built that could be used. So that would just reduce the short-term investment that we need in infrastructure that, we all are would get charged for in order to bring on more data centers, to serve more data centers. But there's obviously, there's the issues that you talked about, which is that we aren't sure whether or not data centers would really commit to this flexibility. And then, utilities have resisted efforts to try to be more efficient in the past, whether that's with, non-wire alternatives or, GETs or other issues. So I guess I'm a little bit skeptical that it could actually play out in practice, but I think it is there is a way where regulators could require utilities to condition service to data centers on being flexible.
Yeah, and you cite a study in the paper that shows that if these giant data centers could just be a little bit flexible, just shut down for a few hours a year, it could save billions of dollars, which it seems to me like is somewhat in their interest, because if it becomes easier for a utility to say, yes, go ahead and interconnect, then you could just get more data centers online. So it seems like it's to their benefit too. Ari, do you have any perspective on the question of flexibility in data centers?
Well, it eats into the utilities' profits because the point of flexibility is to reduce the new infrastructure we need, and that's how they're making their money. So, as Eliza was talking about, that's why utilities have historically been, at best lukewarm on these sort of flexibility initiatives like demand response.
They like high peaks, I guess. It justifies their spending.
But again, maybe we're in a situation where growth is escalating so much,
Right.
so fast that they have to start thinking outside the box. But our concern is that actually, this data center growth is just causing them to just entrench all of their existing worst practices.
Yeah.
And just double down on their narratives and not, really attacking these sort of opportunities to reduce costs for everyone. And instead, they just want to keep building more infrastructure.
Right. This is like, an alcoholic. The booze was starting to run out and like a new truck has showed up outside with barrels of whiskey on it. So, well, we're getting near the end of time. So let's transition to that then. So those are a few solutions, which is like, I got to say, and I know this is not, your fault, but like none of these are really like super satisfying. All of them are a little bit piecemeal. All of them are going to work in some PUCs and not others. Some of them require legislative changes. Some of them don't. So there's just a lot of like distributed work that needs to happen to prevent this from taking place, to prevent the public from getting stuck with these costs. But to sort of wrap up, like the last section of the paper, so you go through a thing where you say that data centers don't necessarily pass the cost-benefit test because in addition to getting subsidized by utilities in all these various ways, they're getting like economic development grants, they're getting state grants, they're getting local municipal grants, they're getting like sales tax exemptions. It sort of reminds me of the sports stadium issue, right? Like everybody thinks they want these things and everybody thinks they're great, but like once you subtract out all the subsidies you spent to get them in your area, are they really paying out anymore? Anyway, you sort of argue that like they don't deserve these subsidies anyway, and all the sort of like national security arguments to the contrary are a little bit silly. But the one point I wanted to hit on, and Ari, I want to hear you talk about this before we're done. So you say one of the dangers here is that subsidies to data centers could interfere with needed power sector reforms. There's a little couple of sentences I want to read here from the paper. As utilities wring profits from the public through special contract approvals, they may be developing a new alliance with big tech, uniting utilities' influence peddling experience with the deep pockets of big tech could further entrench utility control over the power sector. I will say, Ari, these are two of the most chilling sentences I have encountered in any PDF in years.
Yeah, I'll take that as a compliment.
I mean, this is like genuinely terrifying that basically like big tech's going to come along with giant bags of money and it's just all going to serve as an excuse for utilities to keep doing what they've been doing, right? Like this is, in a sense, they were nearing a situation where they were going to be forced to change their ways. But now, like, here comes all this new load, big bags of money, base load coming. Like, they're like, yes, we know how to do this. You build gas plants and expensive new transmission lines and get a rate of return. We're all over this. So explain the political economy danger here, basically.
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of data centers being met with sort of low-hanging fruit in the utility world, which is big transmission projects and big gas-fired power plants, the sort of stuff the utilities have been making money off for generations. Yeah. And as Volt's listeners know, there's about 100 different ways we could be reforming the system to improve outcomes for consumers and for clean energy. And concern that we have is that momentum is just being completely lost because of these shiny data centers that utilities absolutely cannot resist and say the only way we can meet this urgent, sudden need is by doing what we've always been doing. Now, there's a long history of large energy users like the big industrial consumers kind of being watchdogs in utility rate cases because they have the biggest incentive to make sure the utility is not being wasteful. But what if we have a world where the largest customers are now all getting on the system here in the 2020s through these special contracts?
Right. So they then don't care if the utilities overcharge everyone else, right?
Well, their biggest interest will be keeping those special deals going.
Right.
And so, they may not be concerned with the rest of the system. And that's really the concern, is that they become allies of the utilities.
Not just allies, but like borderline owners. Like if you're, like some of these utilities are going to have a situation where like the data centers are the bulk of their total load.
Yeah.
So which means that like those customers are going to have incredible influence, just incredible, power over the utility.
Yeah. I mean, that's the concern here. And then, that just entrenches the status quo, which has been the utility bias forever, because this cost of service rate making model has been working for them for a century.
And if they're allowed to use that basic model on data centers, they're not wrong. They will profit immensely because they are going to have to build a bunch of infrastructure. I mean, in other words, we're once again in a situation where utilities are acting against the public interest, but are accurately acting in their own interests, right?
Oh, yeah, they're absolutely following the incentives. And, it's I think, a sort of inversion of what the big tech companies had been doing in this space. I mean, they had for years been advocating for increased competition,
right?
Particularly in parts of the country where we don't have RTOs. But I think there's a real danger here that they just sort of switch gears and really focus on just, getting these data centers connected through the utility processes and then protecting whatever special deals they get.
Whereas the alternative path that you all outline, where data centers power themselves, then they become sort of a counterweight. Then they become almost competitors to utilities. And then you have like a balance of powers keeping each other in check kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's our theory. I mean, I suppose you could spin other theories here as well. You could be really optimistic and think that somehow big tech with all of its, technological powers will somehow modernize the utilities and bring them into the 21st century. I suppose you come up with other theories, but our concern is the story that we lay out. Somewhat pessimistic view of how this could play out.
Well, I mean, hilarious hearing me argue in favor of pessimism. Like, of course, I'm always pessimistic, but like to me, like, just the quantity. I mean, we've mentioned scale over and over again in this pod, but you can't mention it enough. Like that, it is a change of degree sufficient, I think, to amount to a change in kind here. What's happening? Like what's happening around utilities is fundamentally different. And right now, everybody is in panic mode. Everybody's in growth. Everybody's in beat China. Everybody's in, oh my God, the other company is going to get there first. Just like, to me, it looks like they're happily going to jettison their scruples about clean energy and good utilities. You know what I mean? Like, it just seems obvious to me. They're just all stampeding in one direction.
It does seem like speed is the priority. And yeah, I'm not sure. It seems like that's going to carry the day. But, this situation has changed pretty quickly over the last couple of years. So, again, it's going back to the stranded cost issue. It's one reason why I think that has the potential to be the biggest driver of cost shifts is if this turns around completely the other direction in the next couple of years. And then we have all these half-built transmission lines or something like that.
Oh, my God.
And then consumers are left holding the bag.
Eesh. Yes. Well, this is, at the very least, this is something that, if PUC commissioners are listening, I know some of them are, like, I guess it's ridiculous for me to tell them they need to be thinking about this since that's all any of them are thinking about, I'm sure. But like, this is definitely the question of our time.
Yeah. Go back to something that Eliza said earlier, which is just the value of good regulators here, right? I mean, there is no...
Comes back again and again.
Yeah, like there's no silver bullet, as we've also heard many times on many Volts episodes, but there's also no replacement for just regulators doing their job really well and trying to protect consumers as best they can. And, that can be really hard when you have all this sort of background noise about national priorities and economic development.
Yeah. But again, I'll just reiterate that like decisions made now are they're gonna compound over time. So it's very important that we get a lot of this right on the front end, I would think. All right. Well, this has been fascinating, somewhat ominous, but fascinating. Eliza Martin, Ari Peskoe, thank you for your work, the paper, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.